Take your Bibles and turn to Luke 15, please. This fall we've been in a series called Jesus the Storyteller. He was a master teacher among many things, but his ability to tell stories is world-renowned. And today we look at his most famous story. Some scholars have said this is the greatest short story ever told, inside of religious literature and outside of religious literature. It is a very familiar story, one that I sometimes worry that because of its familiarity with us that we will perhaps not hear it very well. So this morning I hope that you'll see it a different way than perhaps you have before. Luke 15, let's look at verse 11. Then he said, "A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me.' So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed into a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. And when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare? And I perish with hunger. I will arise and I will go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it. And let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to be merry. Now his older son was in the field, and he came and drew near to the house, and he heard music and dancing. And so he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And I lost my place. Where is it? So he called one of his servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, because he has received him safe and sound. Your father has killed the fatted calf.' But he was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. And so he answered and said to his father, 'Lo, these many years I have been serving with you. I never transgressed your commandments at any time. And yet you never gave me a young goat that I may make merry with my friends. But as soon as the son of yours came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him.' And he said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It is right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found.'" This is God's word. That was my mistake. I told Chris, stop at verse 24, but I didn't stop at verse 24. I can't read this story broken up like that, so that was my mistake. Very famous story. Now, just to kind of get us kind of going this morning, I need to tell you this. I went to college out of the state. I'm born and raised in Colorado, but I went to college out of state. And this is back in the 70s, and back in those days, you received mail in the mail. And you would read letters from home that way. And I don't know if it was because my parents didn't trust me with money or they didn't want to do it that way, but when it came time for me to come home for Christmas, they never sent cash. What they would send, I don't know if they didn't trust me with it or thought I would spend it on I don't know what, but what they did send me was a gas credit card, a Texaco gas credit card. Now, I love getting letters from home and reading what was happening in Colorado when I was going to school in Texas. But I got to tell you, there was something really special about a Christmas time note from home and a white piece of notepaper wrapped around a plastic card. And the note said, "We look forward to seeing you soon, son." I can still remember running my fingers over the raised letters of that credit card, anticipating going home. And all that meant, the warmth of home, the comfort of home, the familiarity of home. There's just something about the idea of going home that pulls us and warms our heart. Well, this story is a story about a young boy who needed to come home. As we look at this story, the main thing you need to know about the father is that he loved his sons very, very much. He loved both of them very much. They were a part of a village, and in that village, because of his wealth, he would have been very well known. And the people in that village had thought they'd seen love before, but they had never seen the love and the devotion that Jesus is going to describe between this father and his sons. Never had a father loved a son like this man loved those two boys from the moment they were born. He was wise, this father. He was patient. He was firm. He was generous. He was gentle. But mostly he was utterly devoted to his sons. But both of them broke his heart. Both of them broke his heart. Jesus says that the younger son comes to the father and says, "Give me the portion of goods that falls to me. Give me my inheritance. I want to have that now." Now, typically that was given when the father would pass away, and then the older brother would be the executor of the estate and would help, kind of portion out all of the things. But this younger son, he wanted what it was his, and he wanted it right now. And so he asked the father to liquidate his assets and give him his inheritance in the form of cash. Now that means that the whole village knows what's happening, because it's going to take a while. He had a lot of cattle. He had a lot of land. It's going to take a while to sell that off and to liquidate that. And so this was a topic of conversation at the local Jan's restaurant. It was a topic of conversation at the city market. People were whispering about what this young man had asked his father to do. This is a big deal when a son comes to a father and says, "I want my inheritance." In fact, Ken Bailey talks about this in one of his commentaries. I put it on the screen here. He says, if a Jewish boy takes his inheritance and loses it among the Gentiles so that the Gentiles end up with all the resources that had been part of Israel, and then that boy dares to try to come home, there was a ceremony invoked to indicate that kid that he is cut off from his family and his village. A special ceremony was invoked. So the father, as he's liquidating the assets of his home, keeps wondering, is the boy going to change his mind? Will he back out of the deal? And it's going to take some time, so he keeps wondering, is that going to happen? But that day of liquidation could not come soon enough for this young boy. He wanted his hands on that cashier's check, and as soon as he got his hands on that cashier's check, he walked out the gate and he never looked back. He was going to go out and live life to the fullest. And he breaks the relationship he had with his father. I tried to think of a way to bring this down, the scandal of this down, to you and I. This is what I came up with. It would be a little bit like coming home and saying to my wife, we've had 37 years, great years together, and we're probably going to have another 10. But in anticipation of you dying, I have selected my second wife, and I've invited her to move in to the downstairs bedroom. Would that be okay with you? Do you hear the scandal in that? How does she feel? She feels already discarded, see? That's what this son is basically asking his father to die. He's saying, would you give me my portion of my inheritance? He's really saying, I wish you were dead. And then he goes into a distant country. And everything looks good. Everything that's shiny, he buys. Everything that is bright and self-indulgent and desirable and pleasurable and satisfying is at his fingertips until the money runs out. And the money always runs out at death, if not sooner. And Jesus says a famine comes. The New King James says a severe famine. A severe famine. See, this is before Baptist disaster relief. This is before World Vision, Red Cross. This was before the 24-hour news cycle of the cable TVs. And so there would be times, and people would hear about it, where a specific famine would hit a community or hit a town, and it would devastate that town, and there were no relief organizations to bring relief to that town, and it would end up becoming a chaotic mess. And there are historical accounts of people murdering and even selling their children into slavery in order to buy enough bread to eat, and even cannibalism happening in places in that part of the world. And when Jesus says there was a severe famine, the people who heard Jesus tell this story are imagining that kind of catastrophe. And even with all of this severity of going on and possible cannibalism happening in that far country, the boy does not want to go home. He's not ready to go home. Not until he's about to die does he think about going home. Why? Why did he wait so long? Because he knows what's waiting for him if he goes home. In the Jewish community, according to Ken Bailey, when a young boy does what this boy did and goes into a Gentile country and spends all of that in riotous living, the King James says, in Gentile land, using Israel money in Gentile places, there was a ceremony that would happen if that boy ever dared to come home. If he decided he would ever come home, the entire community would gather at the outskirts of town, and they would go through this process of telling him that he was unwanted. And they would take a pot, and this pot was to symbolize the life of this boy who had spent everything in a far country. And before him, in his ceremony, they would take a pot, and they would break it. And then they would say, this is your life. You once were whole, and you once were welcome, and you once had purpose. But because of what you've done, this is who you are now. You're broken. You're just not who you once were. And you're not welcome here. You broke community. You broke relationship, you broke covenant, and you broke your father's heart. This is who you are, and you're not welcome here. The most shameful thing that could have happened to a Jewish boy was that ceremony. The brokenness that you see here is the brokenness of your life. You are cut off. There was a Hebrew word for it. It was kezazah. Kezazah. Say that with me. Kezazah. Cut off. Not welcome here. You ever felt Kezazah? You ever made decisions in your life that resulted in consequences that made relationships that you have had shattered and broken like that? We all have, at some level. We all have. The boy knows what's waiting for him if he comes home. I think that's why he stays away. I think that's why he stays away so long, because he doesn't want this. But the famine is severe. The famine is great. And finally he says, being cut off is better than dying. And so he wants to go home. And then he sees the village. He braces himself for what is probably going to happen. But there's one thing he had not counted on. He had not counted on a father standing on the front porch every day looking for his son to come home. Looking over the horizon every day, hoping against hope. And then he sees him. He sees something. He sees somebody who's wearing tattered clothes and matted down beard. There was something about him, though, the way he walked, that made the father take a second look, because there was a familiarity about the way that one walking down the road was walking. See, the old man had seen that boy take his first steps. The old man had seen him learn to run. The old man had seen him walk around in the village. He knows that walk. And the scriptures, Jesus says, while he was a long, long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion and ran to his son. Now, when Jesus tells this story, the group of people who heard that story for the first time, some of them begin to cry. You know they did, because they get it. This is a picture of God. They're imagining a God who would run to them. The father ran. Now, you know this, some of you do, that in the Middle East, the patriarch of the family, a man of great dignity and great authority, a man dressed in ornate robes, did not run. It was undignified for him to do that. Anybody remember an old movie star named John Wayne? Sure you do. John Wayne, among other things, was famous for his walk. You can actually Google the John Wayne walk, by the way, and kind of get a clip of it if you need to remember. But when he was first in the movies, he did not like the way he looked on screen. He wanted to have a different look. He wanted to have a more confident look. And so he started practicing in a mirror his walk, so that when he showed up on screen, he had this confident, strong, cool walk. John Wayne didn't run. Men in control don't run. And that's exactly the way it was in the Middle East. For this father to run would have meant that he would have had to gather up his flowing robe up high. The word that Jesus used for run is the word in Greek that really means to sprint. For him to run, he would have had to gather his robe up, and if he was going to sprint, he would have had to gather it up a little bit higher, which would have revealed his bare legs, another shameful thing to do in that culture. He would be showing that. And that was humiliating. A little boy might do that. A slave might do that. But no father would do that. But this father runs. Why? Well, I think he can't stop thinking about his broken boy. He can't stop thinking about him, and he keeps imagining that if the village gets to him first, he'll lose his son. If the village gets to him first and breaks the pot and starts the kazaa process, it will crush his son's spirit. It will crush his son's heart so deeply, his son will never come back. He'll never return to the father. And I think the father said, I can't let the village get to him first. And so he runs. He can't allow the shame of this ceremony to fall on his son, so he pulls up his robe and bares his leg and brings shame upon himself so the shame won't go on his son. His father does what no father would do. This father runs because the father had never stopped loving his boy. No matter how far the boy went away from home, no matter what he had done, the boy never stopped needing his father. So this father, I think, races to intercept the humiliation that should have gone to his son and brings it on to himself. He suffers it. See, this is not really a story of the prodigal son. It's not the story of an older brother. It's the story of a father who runs. It's the story of a running father. God is so filled with compassion for whatever distant country you might have ever gone to, that when you take one step towards him, he runs to you. And I think what Jesus was saying here too is that, don't you get it? Don't you get it that when you turn your heart towards, you want to know what God looks like when he runs? It's when he left heaven and went into the womb of a little teenage girl and was born in Bethlehem and put in a feed trough. That is the Father running to you and to me. That's what he's doing in Jesus. So the father gets to his boy long before this ever gets to happen. And the boy starts his speech. He says, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Could you?" And the father interrupts him. And he turns to the servants. He says, "Go get a ring and put it on him. Go get a robe and put it on him. Go get sandals. Go kill the fatted calf." Because we have to party. We have to celebrate this. My son was dead, but he's alive again. He's come home. So my question to you, sitting in that pew, is could it be possible that God is calling you to come home? Maybe you've been in a really far country. Maybe you've made some really bad choices. Maybe you've been selfish. Maybe you've cheated. Maybe you've stolen. Maybe you've gone through an ugly divorce, or more than one. Maybe you've ripped off innocent people. Maybe you've been in a lifestyle that you can't imagine ever being acceptable in a place like this. That if those sins had ever been confessed here, we would blush. Here's what this story tells us. You can come home. You can come home. Could be you've been hurt by somebody in your family. You know, I have 3 sons, and 2 of them are struggling with church these days. Their friends tell them that they've been hurt by church. They've been hurt by the people who attend church. They don't want to go to church because of harm that has been done by the church. You know, that's a real problem because it actually really does happen. And I'd like to say to those people, I'm sorry if the church has hurt you. Please don't judge Jesus by those of us who fail at following him. You can come home, though. Nobody earns their way home. You just come. Philip Yancey wrote a book called What's So Amazing About Grace, and he has a chapter in that book called The Lovesick Father. And he retells this story in a way that when I read it the first time, I wept. And if I read it the 5th time, I weep. And I thought I would just let you all weep with me this morning with this story. Here's how Yancey retells the story. A young girl grows up on a soybean farm outside of Decatur, Illinois. Her parents do not much care for her music, or her clothes, or her nose ring. She does not much care for their values and their church. They have another argument. She locks herself into the room, her room. And when her dad knocks on the door, she screams, "I hate you!" And she decides to run away. And the place she decides to go is San Francisco. When she gets there, she's much lonelier than she had anticipated, but she soon meets a man who drives the biggest car she'd ever seen, and he gives her a ride. He buys her lunch. He shows her the city. He gives her some pills that make her feel better than she's ever felt. She wanted to feel good really bad, and so she took more pills. And then she realizes how much life and fun her parents had been robbing her of. This good life goes on for about a month, 2 months, and then a year. And the man with the big car, she calls him boss, teaches her a few things about what men like. It's a side of life that she never knew in Decatur, Illinois. The parties and the penthouse and the gifts and the glamour are like being in a whole nother world to her. After a year, the first sallow signs of illness begin to appear. It amazes her how quickly the boss turns against her and mean. And before she knows it, he turns her out on the street. Now she has no money, no clothes, no car, no parties. She's alone. She uses what she knows on the street to get whatever money she can. But she looks gaunt and thin. The men she's with now are no longer wealthy and generous, and sometimes they're dangerous and cruel. All her money goes to support her habit. She eats whatever she can find. She sleeps on a metal grate or a park bench. One night, as she lies awake listening for footsteps, all of a sudden everything around her looks different. She no longer feels like a woman of the world. She's a little girl again, lost, cold, and in a frightening city. Her pockets are empty, her clothes are rags, her stomach is hungry. She needs a fix. Her eyes are filled with tears. Then her mind flashes on a single image of her home in Decatur, Illinois, when summer comes and the fields are so green you can hardly take in all that life. Oh God, why did I leave? My dog at home eats better than I do right now. She's sobbing. She knows that more than ever, she wanted anything in her life. She just wants to go home. 3 straight calls, 3 straight connections with the answering machine. Twice she hangs up without leaving a message. The 3rd time she says, "Dad, Mom, it's me. I was wondering about coming home. I'm going to be on a bus. It'll pass through sometime around midnight on Tuesday. If you're not there, I'll just keep going on to New York. Just wanted you to know." Click. The whole time on the bus, she can't turn off the questions. She wonders if they got the message. She wishes that she'd given them more warning. She wonders if they're giving her up for dead. She keeps thinking about what she's going to say to her dad. She keeps rehearsing a little speech in her mind. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know it was my fault, not yours. Can you forgive me?" She hasn't apologized for anything in years. The bus pulls into the station, and the driver says, 15 minutes, folks. That's all the time we have. And we're moving on. 15 minutes to decide her life. She looks in her compact mirror and tries to brush her hair and put lipstick marks off her teeth. She sees the needle marks in her arms and wonders if her parents will notice if they're there. She walks into that bus terminal at 1 o'clock in the morning in Decatur, Illinois. She's imagined 1,000 different scenes in her mind, but not one of them prepares her for what she sees, because there inside the concrete walls around those plastic chairs in that bus terminal in Decatur, Illinois, stands a group of 40 brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents and one dog. And they're all wearing goofy party hats, and they're blowing kazoos, and they're cheering for her as if she were a hero coming back from a war. There's a giant hand-painted sign in the back saying, "Welcome home," taped all the way to the back, on the back wall. Standing in front of that crowd with tear-stained face and a trembling smile is the father whom she had told she hated the last time she saw him. She can't bring herself to look at him in the face as she starts her little speech. "Dad, I'm so sorry. It's my fault." He puts her hands on her face, and he raises her eyes up to his, and he begins to laugh and cry so hard his whole body shakes. And he says, "I know. I know." What he used to say to her when she was a little girl, and he would rock her. "I know. No need for another word from you. You'll miss the party. We have a party." And he takes her little frail body in his arms and brings her home. Jesus told this story 2,000 years ago. He says, you start with a father like that and multiply it by 1 billion, and you start to get the idea of what God thinks of you when you go into a far country and start to come home. Come home. Now, I thought, as I was preparing this talk, most of you are home, or you wouldn't be here today. You're already home. You know what that means? If you're going to put yourself in this story, where are you? See, there's another boy. And the other brother is at home. And the other brother never left the geographical home of his father, but he's never had the father's heart. And I'm convinced that there are a whole lot of us who have a heart that is distant from God and come to church every single Sunday. And so I'm calling the older brother to come home too. Because you remember towards the end of the story, he's the one that's upset. He's the one that's ticked off. He's thinking, that should have happened. In fact, I should have been the one with a hammer. This is what should have happened, and you didn't let it happen. I'm not going in there. But the father begs him to come in. Do you know how the story resolves? Read it. We never know if the older brother ever goes into the party. We know the younger brother does, but we don't know if the older brother does. And I think Jesus leaves this story unresolved because it's still an invitation to those of us who come to church all the time, who know the Bible, who are good people, who keep the rules, but whose hearts are distant from the Father. And the Father is still saying, come home. And that could be most of us here, or at least some of us. Now, I started thinking about this again. I thought, if you want to know how much the Father loves you, look at Jesus' face. Look at the cross. Look at what he went through so that we could come home. If you think about it, Jesus experienced kezazah so that we could come home. Remember what he said on the cross? My God, why have you cut me off? Why have you kezazah? And of course the answer is so that Joe could come home. So Larry could come home. So Madeline could come home.
Before the world began, you were on his mind, and every tear you cried is precious in His eyes. Because of His great love, He gave His only Son, and everything was done so you would come. And nothing you can do can make Him love you more. And nothing that you've done could make Him close the door. Because of His great love, He gave His only Son, and everything was done so you would come. Come to the Father, though your gift is small. Broken hearts, broken lives, He will take them all. The power of the Word, the power of His blood, and everything was done so you would come. Nothing you can do could make Him love you more. And nothing that you've done could make Him close the door. Oh, because of His great love, He gave His only Son, and everything was done so you would come. Come to the Father, though your gift is small. Broken hearts, broken lives, He will take them all. Oh, the power of the Word, the power of His blood, and everything was done so you would come. Come to the Father, though your gift is small. Broken hearts, broken lives, He will take them all. Oh, the power of the Word, the power of His blood, and everything was done so you would come. The power of the Word, the power of His blood, everything was done so you would come.